As it so happens, Eusebius, the bishop of Cezareea, who is not to be confused with the Arian bishop of Nicomedia, who baptized Constantine on his deathbed, is one of the most important sources of the reign of Constantine, to whom he claimed he was a good friend, although we cannot be sure whether this friendship was reciprocated by the emperor, who seemed to be only friends to his own august person, and at the end of the day, maybe this was the best for Eusebius himself, given the sad endings of some of the emperor's friends and relatives. And thus Eusebius lived a long and very productive life, fortunately for us, although we do not for sure how he died. So I could argue that the connection lies here. However, this is not the reason why I propose this subject to this School of Byzantine Studies. The true reason is quite convoluted, complicated, and it starts with a question. Have you ever wondered how come that we can be so sure about the chronology of the ancient world? How is it possible? To whom do we owe this knowledge that enables us to say that this battle took place in that year, or that this king or emperor came to rule after this other emperor between that year and that other year? Do we owe this to someone who must have been a genius and a polymath and took care in compiling such a list of events and durations of the reigns of the most important sovereigns of the most important states of the ancient world? If so, who is that someone? Is it an ancient scholar or is it a modern one? Well, the answer is yes and no. And to both of these two hypotheses lying within the terms of questions above. There are several such ancient scholars, not just one. And it so happens that only the work of one of such scholars has survived to our days. But what most of us are not aware of, unfortunately, is the fact that this work is in fact lost. And what we have today is are two of its ghosts dispersed at the both ends of the European world, namely Britain and Armenia. For, you guessed it, I do consider Armenia as a part of the European world and civilization. And these two ghosts have haunted several modern scholars who chase the image of the original opus, which is now lost. That is why I have given that ambiguous yes and no answer to the question, who is that someone? Is it an ancient scholar or is it a modern one? And I assume you must have already guessed so far that this father figure for the modern system of chronology of the ancient world is Eusebius of Cezareea, and the Byzantine connection lies within the whole tradition of Byzantine chronographies, exempli Gratia, John of Antioch, John Malalas, George, so-called Syncelus, or the anonymous chronicles such as Chronicon Pascale, etc. Moreover, we owe Eusebius, well, not only him, the fact that he proposed a solid synchronicity, which, with all its faults, will become canonical between the Greek and Roman chronological systems and the Judeo-Christian one that we, more or less, still use today, with, of course, the important addition that we are very well all aware of Dionysius the Lesser, exiguus, of breaking the history of the world in two, what comes before the birth of Christ and what comes after. This particular work of Eusebius, this original opus that I have mentioned above, is, of course, his chronicle. And this chronicle is now, in fact, lost. So another yes and no answer. We have it, yet we don't have it. So lost is it that we cannot even be sure of its original title, which we derive from a mention of his in another opus of his own. At the beginning of his Ecloge Propheticae, written before the Edict of Serdica in 311, Anno Domini, which preceded the more famous Edict of Milan in restoring the status of legality to the Christian Church and tolerance to the Christian faith, Eusebius writes that he has a chronological work with the following title. And please excuse me for using the Erasmian pronunciation and not the Ruthenian one, to which Byzantinists are more accustomed, but I, unfortunately, am not. Chronicoi canones kai epitome pantodapes historias Helenon pe kai barbaro. Id est chronological canons with an epitome of the histories both Greek and non-Greek. And again, excuse me for choosing, along with Alden Moshammer and other colleagues, this translation for the word usually rendered as barbaric or barbarians. It is not out of political correctness that I chose to do so, but because of the fact that it is more suitable for the original Greek meaning of this word, in my opinion. But, and yes, there is a but in all of this. Actually, there are a lot of buts, but every step of the way, as we are all going to see. If you recall, I have also mentioned the word that must have puzzled you. I said loud and clear, and I quote myself, this work in fact is lost, and what we have today are two of its ghosts, dispersed, I said, at the both ends of the European world, namely Britain and Armenia. And I assume that you must have been puzzled by the word ghosts. I suppose I am now at the point where I should explain myself, but you should be aware that this is where the plot thickens and everything gets really complicated. So I beg of you to stay with me on all this. Who are those two ghosts? As I previously stated, the text of this chronological canon is lost. We cannot even know when was it lost, but definitely the terminus post quem must be after the 9th century AD, for George the Syncellus has probably seen the Chronicle of Eusebius with his own eyes. If one wishes to blame the usual suspects for this loss, we could all blame the Crusaders or the Turks, whichever you prefer. I, for myself, will blame no one, for I cannot possibly know who is precisely to blame. But lost, as I said, it was. However, the original opus of Eusebius, written, as one would expect, in Greek, has vanished, as I said, almost entirely. People knew it existed from several allusions and references and quotes made by other ancient scholars, and of course, by Eusebius himself. Another locus that comes to my mind is in his very famous History of the Church, where he speaks of this work. As I said, sometimes it happens with the vanished bodies that they are replaced by ghosts. Namely, these two ghosts are two different manuscripts in two different languages, one in Latin, with the best manuscript copy to be found in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And please excuse me one moment, because I would like to share a page with you. Just a second. Where is it? There it is. Share. So that's yes. A page of this manuscript. Can you see it?
It's black here. It's black. Oops. It's black. Yes. Now
what can I do?
Yes. Now it's visible now. Yes.
Cool. So this is those are two pages because in fact they all come in binary, so to speak, in pairs, almost all of them. As you can see, you have several rows and of course several columns, and I will explain at a later point what is it all about. Those two pages deal with the age that we are all acquainted with, the age of Julius Caesar and Pompey and Crassus, whose names you can see on the screen. And now I will stop share the page and come back to my text. And the other one, as I said, is in Armenian. And it is this latter manuscript, so the Armenian one, that is the wandering book I announced in my title. As for the former, we owe it to another one of the church fathers, namely Saint Jerome. And I would like to share a picture of the saint with you now. Just a second. as I warned you, my laptop is not very fast. Where are the? Excuse me. I have a problem. I cannot find the controls. Just a second. No. I have an option here that says exit minimize video. That said that it will make it a full screen, or I would exit the video. Definitely. Excuse me?
Yes, it's good. Now
the problem is that I cannot find the button. It's minimized, and I cannot find the button with the yeah. I had an hesitation because I said okay, just a moment. So that is Saint Jerome by Pinturicchio.
wait a little bit. Yes.
Yes, and
Now it's black.
it's gonna come up. It's gonna come up.
Yes. Now it's visible. Yes.
Good. So I will stop sharing and come back to my text, which is unfortunately on my laptop. Yes, it is that Jerome who is held as a saint patron of translators and those who learn foreign languages. And as you can see, we all owe him something besides the passion for history and learning. Had it not been for Saint Jerome, allegedly, who knows? Maybe I could not have been able to bore you to death in my attempt at speaking the language of Shakespeare and Marlowe. But, and now we get to the technical problems. One technical notice: the Chronicle of Eusebius is structured in two parts. The first part gives a brief history of the world from the biblical and mythological ages up to the present day of Eusebius, naturally, which becomes less and less biblical and mythological and more historical after the second year of the reign of the Persian king of kings, Darius. The second part is more important, and the excerpt from the manuscript in the Bodleian Library at Oxford comes from, of course, the Latin variant, and the Latin variant, as basically, it's the second part. The second part is more important, and it might be, as many scholars view it, the invention of Eusebius himself, although I'm not at all convinced that this may be the case. It's basically a table where one can see year after year, mostly, which important events took place under the reigns of the Assyrian, Egyptian, Persian, Greek, Macedonian, and Roman rulers, kings, and emperors, not necessarily in that order. It is important to keep in mind that only the Armenian manuscript contains both parts, while the Latin version of Saint Jerome gives us only the second part, to which Jerome added his own table from the year 326, this is where the Eusebius stops, up to the year of the infamous Battle of Adrianople, Idest Anno Domini 378. In order to understand the importance and the extent of the work of Eusebius, and I will come back to those details at a later point, we need to take into account the difficulties presented by the task of synchronizing the Judeo-Christian chronology with the Greek and Roman one, or ones, should I say, for there are several. After all, since the Bible does not have a chronological table and cannot give precise dates, we would be, I hope no one expects to find, I don't know, King Solomon reigned between the year so-and-so before Christ in the Bible. But instead it gives us the number of years of the lives, of the reigns of its most important characters, If you remember, this is how we know the age of Methuselah, or how many years has the same King Solomon lived, and how many years has he reigned, and so on and so on. This task is already very difficult, meaning to establish a chronological line of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so it happens that that is why we have so many variants of the year of the creation of the world. It depends on the calculuses that are done. But when one looks at the Greek and Roman chronologies, not to mention all the other barbarians that we have translated as non-Greeks, it all becomes a feverish nightmare. It might have been easy for Thucydides or Xenophon to write their own works and keep them chronologically fit. After all they had to do was take into account mostly a single calendar, the Greek one, which has the year starting in autumn. You heard it well, in autumn. Sometimes in September, in October, November, but mostly in autumn. And the years according to the Olympiad system. Remember, every Olympiad has a 4-year cycle. And the succession of the Athenian archons and the Spartan kings, to which it need be, sometimes they add the regnal years of the Persian kings that were involved in the action. The conquests of Alexander the Great will alter profoundly this simple reality, because the Macedonian calendar was not exactly similar to the Greek one, but yes, the year still starts in autumn. However, it is not only that. Alexander has conquered the whole Persian Empire, as we all know, and that means that in many parts of the world, Jewish, Phoenician, Mesopotamian, and so on, the year starts in spring. Moreover, the political structures which emerged after the death of Alexander in 326 BC used different chronological systems. The regnal years of various kings, for example, Gratia, Ptolemaic Egypt, and or Antigonid Macedon, or eras with a starting point, we call it epoch, in a certain important year, a king or a community. Example, Gratia, the era of the kingdom of Pontus, kingdom of the famous king Mithridates Eupator, which starts in 297 BC. The era of the Seleucids, with a starting point into 312 BC, which, much to our surprise, is still in use today by the Syrian church. And yes, there are documents today dated according to this era. And there are also civic eras. Either they were used by a single city, such as the era of Tyre, the famous city of Tyre in Phoenicia, with a starting point in the 126 BC, or the era of Antioch in Syria, that Antioch, beginning in 64 BC. And then Antioch will use another era, the so-called Caesarean era, starting in 48 BC, so on and so on. To make matters even more complicated, as if they weren't already, let us go back to the calendar issue. Thus, the standard. I'm now giving just a single example. The standard Seleucid era, according to the Macedonian calendar, has the year starting in autumn. That is, when I said standard, I meant official. The era of the documents of the kingdom, and the era most Greek inscriptions used in the Greek inscriptions throughout the kingdom. Therefore, the year 1, there is no year 0, any era. The year 1 of this era, coinciding with Seleucus, the first retaking Babylon in 311 BC, starts therefore in the autumn of 312 and ends at the end of the summer 311. However, some people like to make things really complicated, but believe it or not, they do it because they wanted to make them simple for them. The subjects of the kingdom, and especially those who found themselves speaking other languages than Greek, either Akkadian, Jewish, Phoenician, they used their own calendar, but with the Seleucid era. And therefore, we have what we call today the non-official Babylonian Seleucid era, who has its first year starting in the spring of 312 and ending at the end of the winter 311. As you can see, we already have a problem. There are 6 months, 3 plus 3, which are left apart. If you try to synchronize the same year according to those 2 separate calendars. And I will not even dream to enter another huge issue, which was pretty recently discussed in a seminar about ancient calendars, which is the problems of synchronicities between solar and lunar calendars. For as you all know, all those peoples around in the Levantine area used these types of calendars. And those of us who have needed to come across the Muslim calendar, we all know very well how confusing it might be when you simply try to synchronize the dates between the year after the Hejira and the year after Jesus Christ. And fortunately, for this we have systems. But Eusebius did not have those systems. And all this data, all these problems were to be solved at his time. Some scholars would like to think that it was Eusebius himself who basically did all the work. Some other, especially in the older times, take into account the fact that Eusebius is a very serious scholar, at least for the ancient world, and he gives us references, not the precise reference that we have today, but still, at least, namely references to the authors that he used. He used several Greek historians, like, for instance, one which is not very appreciated today, Diodorus Siculus. Today we prefer other historians to Diodorus, but Eusebius preferred Diodorus. And he also used a set of chronographers who worked after a famous character, which was Eratosthenes. And I'll pause for a moment here to remind you, for those of you who forgot, that the code name that the ancient scholars gave Eratosthenes was Beta, or Hysteros, meaning the second, because they considered him to be very proficient in all the sciences, but never the best. And remember, he's the one making the calculations of astronomical calculations that we still appreciate today. And he also established some chronological systems that are lost now, but who are known to all those scholars. And there are several names that Eusebius cites, quotes, refers to, namely Alexander Polyhistor, Castor of Rhodes, and a figure which is very interesting, Porphyry of Tyre. And if you remember at the beginning, I tried to confuse you or to make you laugh, or make you smile, by using that that ambiguous answer, yes and no. There are several scholars, yes, there are several ancient scholars, and yes, there are several modern scholars. But we only have one, which is Eusebius, because all the other works of those scholars, unfortunately, are lost. They survived only in fragments, and we have tried to reconstruct those works, but it's impossible to have a clear picture. Probably the most important of those works was that of Castor of Rhodes, and I think more important than this one was the Chronicle made by Porphyry of Tyre. Porphyry of Tyre, let me remind you, was a pagan philosopher. So pagan that he wrote treatises kata Christianon, against the Christians. And those treatises were at a later point used also by the famous Celsus. And both of them were lost, but the works of those two were lost. But as you probably very well recall, we do have Celsus because another friend of ours, Origenes, has given a critique of those two critiques of the Christian religion. Unfortunately, Origenes did not choose to do so for the Chronicles, or the Chronicle of Porphyry of Tyre. So, if we can reconstruct a bit of his non-Christian beliefs, I'm speaking of Porphyry, we know nothing of his Chronicle. And that is why I said at the beginning that I beg to differ that Eusebius, with other colleagues, who seem to believe that probably Eusebius did most of the work in this synchronization of the chronological systems, because most probably the most nightmarish work has been already undertaken before Eratosthenes. If you remember, Diodorus, Polybius before him, they have this system of presenting a coherent narrative of history, but divided into several successive parts. They will dedicate usually 1 or 2 books for an Olympiad, and then the succession of the 4 years of the Olympiad, and then that book would follow a cycle according to the histories of the regions of the Europe, Asia, and Africa that they deal with. So it's pretty well structured, although it is confusing, or it can be confusing when you try to extract the precise years of some event. So that was the manner of writing history and making chronology before Eratosthenes. Eratosthenes pushed it a step further on because, as I said before, there were so many chronological systems in use in the Mediterranean area that it was necessary to make a reconciliation of them. And probably the Chronicle of Porphyry historian and a philosopher that Eusebius appreciated a lot. He called him the learned philosopher, although pagan, so no grudges between them. Probably that Chronicle of Porphyry is the main source and the main corpus for the histories, the chronologies, the chronological systems of the Greek and non-Greek worlds. What Eusebius did, and that is my opinion, and this is where I beg to differ with some of our colleagues. What Eusebius must have done was, who knows, maybe it was not even him who has done it, because he had another Christian. He had also different Christian sources. For instance, the Chronicle of Julius Africanus was make this synchronicity between the chronology according to the Bible and those chronological systems. And his innovation, his invention, his food on the table, brought on the table by him, was probably that table, and I will bring back the shared image of the manuscripts.
Yes.
Just a second.
Yes.
Can you? I know it's black now.
Black now, yes, and soon will appear. Yes, now.
Okay. So now I come back to it. So as you can see, there are several columns and several rows. And I don't know whether you can see it or not, but you could see on top of the page the indication of the chronological systems used. In that case, we have the Alexandrian years, meaning the regnal years of the kings in place at that time. Then the consules, you can see it on top of the picture, and the Christian one. And the text gives us the events that I was talking about. And you can see the synchronicities that are made. And also, I will insert here a hint of what I would like to end up this talk with, meaning just try to use this, just try to copy it, just try to, do something with it, and you're gonna see how easy it is to displace a column. And if you displace a single column, everything goes amok. And that is again the page of what we consider to be the best Latin manuscript, and some other scholars with Moshammer, which is one of the greatest experts on Eusebius, and Fotheringham, who edited the manuscript, they consider it to be the most solid version of the text. But it has its problems. We're gonna see what is it all about. And the reason I didn't make an organized PowerPoint was that it had no use, since the pièce de résistance of this PowerPoint was missing. Namely that we are now in the year of the plague, and as you very well know, the libraries are not very well easily accessible, and the copy I couldn't basically find a good picture of the Armenian manuscript to show it to you. I only have very poor images, and that was the pièce de résistance. But it was basically something like that, and in Armenian. I hope there is at least one of us who understands Armenian. I don't. Coming back to the issues presented by the text, I will remind you how difficult it is to copy a text today when we have laptops, artificial lighting, and everything we need. And I will try to bring a smile up on your faces, and I hope you are still with me. If not, maybe this will make you come back. By telling you a sort of an anecdote, which is true. As you very well know, the most copied book in the Middle Ages was, of course, the Bible, and especially the Gospels. There are so many copies that I don't think one could ever even dream of making a comparative study of the manuscripts or of the copies of the manuscripts altogether, to see how they differ because of how they were copied by hand, using only natural light or I have a lapsus. Luminare în engleză? Candle. Wax candles. And as I said, I would like to make you smile. Those of you who used Facebook probably have seen pictures with cat paws on the gospel manuscripts, because sometimes cats are there and the ink is not dried. And that is not the only problem. A cat, of course, could, in the case of the Gospels, the things are easy to solve because you all know the text of the Gospels. But imagine that you only have one copy of a manuscript and the ink is not dried, and you place a part of a letter and the whole name is destroyed. And that name maybe was Hapax, one of those names that only occur once in all our ancient tradition. And speaking of copying Gospels, the other anecdote is that, and this is true, it's not an anecdote, this is true. There is a copy of the Gospel which has, again, those two pages divided by one pages by 2 columns each. And the copyist was probably either at the beginning of his career, or maybe at the end too, either very tired, either, well, something happened to him, because he basically copied the same fragment 4 times on all the 4 columns. Makes no sense. And then he continued 4 pages later. This is how manuscripts are copied. And please keep that in mind, because there is one point where you shall come back to it. So, I will, for the moment, stop here with the Chronicle and come back to Eusebius, because and his manuscript. I probably should tell you a few words about Eusebius himself. We used to call him Eusebius Pamphilii or Eusebius of Cezareea. It's the one and the same person. And the first name is due to the fact that he was the pupil, the disciple, the closest friend, maybe even the son, adopted son of a great scholar whose work is almost entirely lost today, that a certain Pamphilius, who was a Christian, who was very learned, who had a huge library, which some of it was bequeathed to Eusebius. And he was a great collector of manuscripts of the Bible, and he was a follower of Origenes. And as you can see, that explains the personality of Eusebius and the diverse characteristics of his works. After all, he left us with a life of Constantine, basically the only one that has survived to us. An eulogy to Constantine. As I said, he claimed to be his friend. Lots of works. Plus, of course, the Chronicle. And another point is to be made is that two of his most important works, the history of the church and this Chronicle, they have had probably at least 2 editions. In the case of the history of the church, we even suppose that there might have been 4, and we do not even know for sure which one of it is the one we use today. Why 4? The first one, written before the persecution of Diocletian, where, of course, his tone was different. Christianity was tolerated, more or less. Another one, written after the persecution, but before the Edict of Serdica. And another one after the Edict of Serdica, and another one during the life of Constantine, and so on. We don't know, and it's a full controversy, which one of these editions we have. And I was speaking about the history of the church, which is his most famous work. In the case of the Chronicle, whose text we don't even possess, if you remember, I said before that, I previously said that it is mentioned in the work which was published before the persecution. So basically, the first, so to speak, edition of this Chronicle dates before. And obviously, it must have been either continuated, either edited, either reworked after the persecution, since it stops in 326. Parenthesis. The Armenian edition, however, stops in 311. Close parenthesis. So we are only left to guess. If this was really the text that Eusebius wanted to write. So as you can see, it is complicated, it is convoluted, it is, and how much time do I have?
10 minutes, but if you want more, we can make more.
Okay. And now, I will come back to the problem of the reconstruction of the text, which I didn't even touch. Another shared screen. This is Josephus Justus Scaliger. His alleged ascendance was the family della Scala. His origin was Italian. He lived in France, and he taught at Leiden. And his huge collection of manuscripts, as you can see, all these scholars have something in common, has been donated to the University of Leiden. I'll stop share and come back to because I need something. And now, Scaliger, who had a friend and disciple, one of that you are probably familiar with, at least if not for philological reasons, maybe for the fact that his name is given by Eco, Umberto Eco, to one of the characters in Foucault's Pendulum. Isaac Casaubon, the famous philologist, who was invited to Paris in 1599 by Scaliger in order to work together on the reconstruction of the Chronicle of Eusebius, because that was Scaliger obsession. That was his Fata Morgana. And in 1602, Casaubon has discovered and has sent to Scaliger a transcription, and that is a very important point for people interested in Byzantine history or Byzantine literature, the rediscovered chronicle of George, the one we call the Syncellus. And they are both excited to see that it contained many passages that were definitely from Eusebius and from Julius Africanus. And there were some other passages where the Greek philologist that Scaliger was, he was very good at that, was pretty confident that he could attribute or not to Eusebius or to Julius. And so, in 1606, Scaliger published his Thesaurus Temporum, which comprised the Chronicle of George the Syncellus and all his reconstruction of the Chronicle of Eusebius, plus another quite recent discovery, a list of the winners at the Olympic Games, only the stadium, the run-up, not all the other competitions. And what Scaliger did was to basically rewrite the text of Eusebius, having the firm conviction that he couldn't be wrong. A brief word about Scaliger. He was a Protestant, that's why he left to Leiden, and he was very, 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 very confident in himself, and he had a very sharp tongue, and he had a very sharp pen, and he was very ironic to his opponents. Unfortunately for him, because in lots of cases, his reconstruction have been proven wrong. For instance, and I will not confuse you with all the manuscript traditions, everything, and all the judgments and reasonments that were made, but he basically got it all wrong when reconstructed the manuscript himself. He basically thought that the older ones were the newest ones, and the newest ones were the older ones. And at that time, there was not even a whisper. Nobody knew, nobody was even aware of the Latin manuscript of Saint Jerome, Oxford, and of the Armenian manuscript, which at that time, God knows where it was. However, and this is where the plot thickens, we approach a bit of a Hollywood movie, more or less. In 1787, George Johannesian, a name that shouldn't be forgotten, wrote a letter to the Mekhitarist library and community in Venice to inform them that this new manuscript, the copy of the manuscript, was found in Jerusalem containing that very work of Eusebius, Chronicle, that I talked about. And that is the manuscript that I described at the beginning. And unfortunately, I don't have a visible page, at least a page of it. An Armenian whose name I cannot pronounce, and I will not pronounce, for I do not want to be so barbaric to his name. I will give, his name was, but we know him by the name of Auher, or Osher, prefer, who lived in Venice at that time. He asked for a copy of the manuscript, and the copy was made, and it was dispatched to him in Venice. And where it arrived in 1793. Now, Auher was a very, very prudent man. He knew that the manuscript, this copy, it was obvious, contained many errors. So he edited it, he prepared it for publication, but he hesitated to do so because, well, he really wanted to see the original manuscript, which entre nous soit dit is paleographically dated to the 12th century AD, so it is quite a late manuscript, before publishing it. And he also had an assistant by the name of Mai. He was an Italian. And that assistant was quite impatient and partner that, well, they do not publish the manuscript. And so Mai published this first copy of the manuscript that he and Auher worked on in Venice. His edition was made in Milan, not in Venice. So the prudent Auher who had finally received his second copy of the manuscript, the better one, managed to publish his copy in 1818. And I will try to give you an image of the cover, the Latin cover of the edition of Auher. Just a second. Share screen. It's black. It's white. You see it?
Yes, yes.
Good. So, I will navigate a little bit in it in order to give you a sample of what his edition looked like. Let's go, let's say, to page 3. Just a second. You see, you have the Armenian text there, and you have his Latin translation there, and you have the Greek edition given by Scaliger, which, remember, is basically a fictitious reconstruction of the text. This is not the Greek of Eusebius. And that was for some time, that should have been the standard version. But the irony of the matter is that Auher publishing it later than Mai, it was Auher who was accused of plagiarizing Mai, although it was the other way around. And it so happens that for those of you who prefer to use the edition in the famous Patrologia by Min, in that corpus, you find the edition of Mai, not Scaliger's and not Auher's. because at that time they considered it to be the best. And so, when the corpus of the writers of Byzantine history was made, Schöne, that you are all, I hope, all familiar with, has decided to associate with an Orientalist by the name of Petermann. And Petermann worked on the Aucher edition. He also traveled to Constantinople in 1864 in order to retrieve the original manuscript. And he was informed by the Armenian community there that the manuscript is no longer in Constantinople. The manuscript was in, they said, back in Jerusalem. Well, it was not back in Jerusalem because today it's in Erevan, and it ended up in Erzincan back then in Armenia. But Petermann worked on Aucher. And so he gave us basically the same version of they gave us, and that is what we can find in the standard edition of the Corpus Scriptores Historiae Byzantine, the Schöne Petermann edition, that unfortunately I have also used for my PhD. I said unfortunately because it has problems. Because Schöne, basically what he did was rework the work of Scaliger, while Petermann gave him the Latin translation of the Armenian text. So that's how they worked. And so the edition in Schöne is basically, I will use a bad word, please forgive me for that, the fake Greek text, which is basically now Schöne's Greek of a supposed Eusebian text, and the Latin translation of Petermann. And that's 1866. And to conclude, what is today considered to be the standard edition up until this year of Eusebius is a German translation by another Orientalist, was Helm. And that's what I said. That's why I said that unfortunately I used Schöne and not Helm, because most of the scholars, however, they still use Schöne. And I have the pleasure to announce you that this year the French just a second. The French publishing house Le Belles Lettres has finally given us a French translation of the Armenian edition of the first section of the Eusebius Chronicle. It's only the French text, fortunately for us. Unfortunately for those who want to study it in Armenian, it doesn't have the Armenian text attached to it, but finally we have it. And I will use my probably another 10 minutes before concluding in order to point out now the problems of working with this, how should we call it? Wandering, fictitious, phantomatic, morganatic, call it whatever you like. Work which existed, which does not exist anymore, which most of our colleagues used in a Greek rendering, which is not the original, or the Latin translation, which of course was a translation, from a translation which was the Armenian, and that is why Helm finally chose to bypass Latin, and that's why he only kept the German translation, which is the choice of the new French edition. So now, if you compound all of these problems, you'd realize how tricky this what is. And let me remind you once again that the crux of the matter is that the whole chronological system we have today of the ancient world relies on this text. Now, I do not want to imply that our chronological system today is wrong. What I want to stress out is that whenever we write an ancient date, for instance, I come back to my Seleucids. We, for instance, say the first year of the Seleucid era is 312, remember? And that has a problem. Because which year is 312? Is it the year which starts in the autumn of 313 and ends in the summer of 312? Or is it the year that starts in the autumn of 312 and ends in the end of the summer of 311? Not to mention, remember, the problem of the calendar synchronicities. Okay, so I strongly recommend it to you, to those who wish to be aware of those issues and those tricks, so to speak, to try to figure out which year is it, and do not content yourselves with, let's say, the Battle of Magnesia took place in 189 BC. Again, what year is that? That is one issue. And then, I come back to the problem of the copists and the anecdote I told. In his introduction to his translation, Saint Jerome said that he basically had only one issue with the text, which is the correct reading of the text. And I will again share that picture. You see, obviously, you have to be very careful when you try to give the correct order of reading of the text. This is what Saint Jerome said, it was his main problem. But what a lot of scholars did not pay attention to, and that should add to the caveat of using this text and all the other texts, Eusebius and Saint Jerome, is that Saint Jerome said how he worked on it. And believe it or not, he said in his introduction, notario velocissime dictaverim, or in plain English, I dictated it, now it depends on how you like to translate it, as fast as I can to a scribe, or I dictated it to a scribe who was as fast as he could. Imagine, what does it mean to dictate this to a scribe? And at the end of the day, you are sure that there are no errors left in it. Can you see what I'm hinting at? There is another problem. There are text differences between the Armenian and the Latin variant of Eusebius. Exempli gratia, again with my Seleucids. For the late part of the dynasty, Eusebius, Armenian Eusebius, he, where the last Seleucid kings died a horrible death, mostly in battle, but not all the times. I will spare you the details. He says that, well, they killed themselves in the last moment. For instance, Antiochus IX was surrounded by the soldiers of Seleucus VI, and he killed himself. Then Seleucus VI, who was, now I will not spare you the details, burned alive in his palace in Mopsuestia, according to Jerome and some other historians. Well, he killed himself before that, according to the Armenian version of Eusebius, and so on and so forth. How do you explain those differences? That is a very complicated issue that would probably be the subject of another talk. So, I will conclude my talk today, which I hope wasn't as confusing as it appeared to be, that we should bear in mind that we work with a text which did not survive to us in its original language, which was copied and recopied. Remember, the Armenian copy is 12th century BC, AD, and just as late, I think it's the Bodleian manuscript and all the stuff. And you saw how easy it is to make mistakes while working and copying this text. So, and not only that, you have to be fully aware of the problems of synchronicities between calendars, eras, or chronological systems. I am grateful to Eusebius, to Saint Jerome, and to all the other scholars, Scaliger and all the others who have gave us this. And I want to not to warn you, to tough word, to remind you, however, that each time we refer to dates up to 378 AD, that those dates, some of those dates, which are not corroborated by other sources, could pose problems. And in some cases, you should, every scholar should check those dates, cum grano salis, and try to see whether there is an error or not, and what kind of error it is, whether it is a cat paw, a tired copyist, problem of calendars or era synchronicity, problem of translation, or some other problems. As for the scholar controversy around Eusebius, I will spare you those details, and I will conclude with these words. Most of our colleagues are not even aware, and really they are not even aware of all those issues. They usually quote Helm, most usually Schoene, and now I hope the new French edition. And especially those who quote Schoene are and I did it myself because of reasons of standardization. They are not aware. Believe me, they are not aware of the fact that Schoene's Greek text, it's the Fata Morgana. It's a ghost. It's a reconstruction, Scaliger and by Schoene, of a text that is lost. And with that, I conclude my presentation today. I know it's very confusing. I apologize for that.